Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Work-life balance has been in the news a lot in the last few years. Young people have been quitting. Bernie Sanders wants Americans to only work 32 hours a week. Gen Zers have surpassed baby boomers in the workforce and are demanding that their employers establish a company's purpose in a way that contributes to a better society. To talk about these new trends and his new book called Full Time, I am delighted to welcome David Bahnsen. David is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group. He's the author of a daily newsletter called Dividend Cafe and the host of National Review podcast Capital Record, dedicated to a defense of free enterprise and capital markets. Welcome, David.
Well, it's so good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So before we start, I like to kind of ask my guests, how did they get there? What's your life path? What got you to all of these jobs that I mentioned? And I know you have way more than the ones I've listed.
Yeah, I mean, the various jobs that I kind of listed out in my book that I thought was sort of a fun way to set up each chapter, the good portion of those were kind of in my teenage years and early years, and were really formative jobs in the way I think most teenage employment is, of teaching people life skills and people skills, discipline. But then in terms of my career path, it's definitely an unconventional one. And it's one in which I think I'm very blessed to have ended up where I've ended up. And yet I get asked a lot how I got here. And I certainly don't recommend the path, because it largely was born out of a lot of challenges. My father passed away when I was 20 and he was only 47. And so I started off, my mom was already gone, and I started off my adult life with absolutely no money and no parents and no idea what I was going to do in my life. Now, that was a tragedy. My dad was my best friend and my mentor, and he was an intellectual giant. And so on one hand, I don't want most people to have to start their adult life without their dad, but I also had an incredible dad. And so I was very blessed to have a worldview, to have a framework for how to think, and a work ethic. And so those things I attempted to parlay into making something of my life. And even though it didn't go down the path that I would have imagined before his untimely passing, now I can look back almost 30 years later, and there's a lot I'm very grateful for throughout my life. So out of that necessity of him dying, I started managing bands and built a pretty successful music management firm, and I sold the company. I was pretty done working with musicians. I was ready to get married, and had been obsessed with the stock market and financial markets for a long time. If I had the path I thought I was going to have before Dad died, I wanted to go, work in business and end up somehow in Wall Street. And so I ended up instead kind of having a roundabout way, and I entered the training program at a firm called Payne Webber that ended up getting bought by UBS shortly after I went there, which was the largest private bank in the world, a big Swiss bank that bought Payne Webber, and went there and worked and built up a pretty good old business as a sole practitioner, and ended up starting to get recruited away and went to Morgan Stanley, which obviously then was, a very, very large investment bank, and became a managing director at that firm. Was there through the financial crisis, worked extremely hard to see business grow during those very difficult times. I consider the financial crisis the sort of seminal moment of my career. And then just before I turned 40 years old, I made the decision to leave, take my team and all my clients with me, and start my own firm. And so that's been now almost 10 years. And I run my own private wealth management firm, managing a little over $5 billion. And we have over 60 people working for us, 7 offices. And it's just a dream career, and I couldn't be more thrilled. And so it enables me to have the freedom to do things like write books and share my opinions. And I can do podcasts and go on television and write weekly commentary with no handcuffs, with no leash. The compliance department is me.
Yeah.
And so I have the freedom now to have a point of view.
Yeah, that's awesome. While you were talking, I was actually thinking that your path, the path that you described, reminds me very much. I don't know if you read the book by David Epstein called Range. It's in praise of generalists, and one of the things that he says is like, while we all think that kind of specialization and working like learning a skill and hammering it, like the 10,000 hour kind of path, is the path to success. On average, what he shows is actually generalists are actually like, they tend to be more successful. And in part, he tells the story through stories of people we know, from Federer to Van Gogh, and he talks about the challenges and the failures and the picking oneself up and then doing something that you didn't expect you were going to have to do or you would do. And that opens doors. And it's like, I mean, I guess I've heard Christians talk about the godly understanding of circumstances where you look at this path. And I also wanted to tell you like a funny story, since we're going to be talking about your book. I don't know if you realize this, but David and we met at a National Review event where I was coming to be on a panel. And it was a pretty hectic travel because my train stopped because it was broken in Philadelphia. I had to take an Uber to New York. Anyway, 5 minutes before the event, I arrive, and then I am told that I'm to interview you for your new book 5 minutes before, and I did not know. So I hadn't read your book, and I have read it since, but we had a really great conversation, and it was a fantastic book of quotes, which now I actually I really recommend it, and I give it as a gift to a lot of people because it's very, very, very important quotes divided very conveniently into like topic of, capital, free market, enterprise, cronyism. I mean, it is just such a remarkable book, but that's how we met, right? So let's talk about your new book. Why did you write this book? What motivated you to write a book addressing concerns about declining work ethics?
Yeah, so this new book, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life, was largely born out of the prior book that you mentioned when we met. That book was, of course, called There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. And in writing that book, which was simultaneously happening with me teaching an economics course at a high school that I had started in Newport Beach, California. And I taught it for 4 different semesters. And so the organization of the curriculum and the syllabus and the kind of class plan coincided with me writing the book. And I've been a ruthless student of economics since I was very, very young. And it occurred to me that of all of the just incredible takeaways that I've learned from, benefited from, and tried to memorialize in that No Free Lunch book from the masters, the great economic legends from von Mises to Hayek to Milton Friedman to contemporaries today that I continue to learn from, I don't know that work has ever been articulated as the standalone unique proposition of human action that is all at once theological for me as a man of faith, that is rooted in this production concept that is so central to classical economics, to Austrian economics, to obviously the supply side school of thought, and then the way in which many of us want to see us understand the humanity of economics and the need for virtue and the need for character and the need for sympathy. And to me, work is this verb that captures so much of what I believe about the human person, about human nature, and is the sine qua non of economics. And I just didn't believe that there was much that had been written about it in that sense. And then, so what happened is, I'm a big fan of an old thing that Bill Buckley used to say, which is, if you don't know what to write about, think of what made you most angry that week. And it infuriates me. The slide I see in the American culture towards a deteriorating view of work. It infuriates me what I see happening in the American evangelical church towards a deteriorating view of work. I see people who are benefiting from a work ethic, from work skills, from work practices, that have a lot of contentment in their job, that get a lot of meaning from their job for good reason. They're good at their job. And then writing articles in the Atlantic about how bad work is. And it drives me up a wall. And so I wanted to write about the need for a renewed love affair with the concept of work at a human level, an economic level, a theological level.
It seems that what you describe is a very good example of what Rob Henderson calls luxury beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. It's these beliefs that people preach but don't live by. And so, yeah, it's
or in some cases they live by but don't preach.
That's true.
That's what I think.
You're right.
Charles Murray has talked about people that don't preach what they practice, because I think that smug writer at the Atlantic does practice this, but refuses to tell others about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's actually start with the definition. What do you call work? I mean, is work, in your opinion, the thing you do for wage? Is work? I mean, the reason why I'm asking this is, like, I was actually talking about your book yesterday with a friend of mine, and she was talking about the Lutheran doctrine of vocation, mm-hmm. and according to that doctrine, right, work effectively, or is any occupation, whether they're like work or volunteering or even taking care of your family. I mean, it's basically, they see it as, as equal in the eyes of God. So it's basically all activities, and work is just one of those many activities. So so she said, I'd be interested in how he defines work. And I thought, well, that's a good question. I'm going to start by asking him.
There's a huge category, probably the operable one, in which my view is identical. And I don't think it's merely a Lutheran idea. It's very Protestant, which is broader than just Lutheran, which is what we call the priesthood of all believers. And what I have a lot in the book about this, which is a repudiation of the sacred secular distinction. So I do not believe that a plumber does kind of lowly physical work while a pastor or a missionary do high spiritual work. I believe that all of those things are kingdom work. And I believe that because I believe that God created us to work. And that's what the book is essentially about, is my creational normative argument. Now, the question that I think she may be getting to, which is a very good one, is whether or not work requires compensation. Is my focus on professional and vocational career work, compensatory work necessary, or do I see room for certain volunteer activities that are also, laborious? And of course, the greatest example in human history is homemakers and caretakers at the home, which of course have throughout history largely been women and mothers. And I've gotten as many questions about that as anything else. And I plan to, when the dust settles a little bit, add a little FAQ appendix type about that very reasonable question on the website of the book. Because on one hand, I make no distinction between compensable work and non-compensable work. But on the other hand, the book was targeted at a sort of theme of vocational work and a defense of careerism. I was pushing back on the idea that our careers don't matter much. And so there is a bias towards work that is compensated. But the definition, though, inherently doesn't require that, which is the production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity.
But as you're talking, I'm thinking that when I used to do charts every week, I would always have people emailing me and say, why didn't you do this chart instead of this chart, right? And I would always say, if I got like 25 cents or $1 each time, I get someone telling me I shouldn't have done what I've done, but it's something else, right? And I would be very rich. And so I feel I've kind of, this is kind of the people asking you, what about this topic that you haven't covered? But it also seems to me that one of the very important things that you're focusing on is the trends in the labor market that we're seeing, in particular with men, right? With men and young people, actually. So you have a chapter, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, I can't remember. Like you start with talking about labor force participation trends and for all ages. And you talk in particular about the problem with men. And so this is why, in my opinion, it makes sense that in your head, you thought about work in this. So can you tell us like the trends that you're seeing that are worrying you?
Yes. And by the way, I appreciate your astute observation that some of what I get into in chapter 2 and the demographics does color the theme of the whole book. And because from a labor participation force standpoint, we simply don't have a decline of women in the workforce. We have a decline of men, and then we have a decline in the aggregate. And so in other words, the bigger problem is with men. And that's why I focused there. But also, we're all kind of somewhat byproducts of our own circumstances. My wife was had a career before we had children, and then she gave that up to be a stay-at-home mom as we were raising our kids. And now she works with me in a senior role in our business. And so these things are unique, and it's hard to incorporate micro to when you're writing about macro and you're trying to cover broad-based principles. But I still believe that definition of work being something that is producing goods and services that meet the needs and wants of humanity, and that doesn't require a paycheck. It does include mothers and home caretakers and includes volunteer work and other things. But yes, I think that the issue with men is a systemic cultural crisis. Very grateful to the work of Nick Eberstadt, who has written about this at much more detail than I did, and provided a lot of the data that I think is vital for people to understand.
So can you give us some of that data? For instance, for labor force participation for men, for instance, what is it that you're seeing that you're worried about?
I think that the one thing I'd say, before I share the most daunting statistic I could make up, I don't think most people understand that the unemployment rate is a measurement of who doesn't have a job divided by the people who have or want a job. And that the labor participation force is the amount of people who have a job or want a job divided by everyone who is over the age of 16. And that labor participation force was near about 68%, 67.5% for a good long run that post-financial crisis headed downwards and sits right now today at 62.5%. So it's 167 million people in the labor participation force out of 267 million people that are over the age of 16. And so that's 62.5%. A 5% drop of that denominator is over 13 million people.
Yeah.
And the demographical statistic that frightens me is the prime working age. I can't stand that there's so many fewer teenagers in the workforce, but obviously that's not leading to massive lost economic productivity or life. I don't think that there are 16-year-olds whose lives are being ruined by not having a job at the moment. I think that their lives are damaged in the future from it, but I'll put that on hold. The baby boomer stat or those over the age of 55 post-COVID, that's come back. It took a while. It's prime working age men. And here's the data point that I can't stop thinking about. There are 84%, 85% of men between the ages of 29 and 54 either have a job or want a job. That's the same number as in the Great Depression of how many people had a job in that addressable demographic.
And of course, that is meaningful because in one case, we had 20 or 18% unemployment, right? People who didn't have a job, it's because they couldn't get a job. And now unemployment rate is it's like 3% roughly. So like those men dropped out. They dropped out of the labor force. Yeah, so that's the scary statistic. And so is that what kind of actually drove you to write the book, or is it more the discourse around work in general that drove you to write the book?
Yeah, I think it's more the discourse, Vero, because Nick had already kind of highlighted some of the demographics. And if I just thought I was writing another book on the statistics and the data and didn't have anything additional to say, I probably would have been less motivated and animated. But the discourse is where I felt I had strong opinions. And by the discourse, I mean a few different things. First of all, the culture at large, everyone is talking about a post-COVID increase in depression, anxiety, mental health, drug and alcohol abuse, alienation. I think we all see in the political sphere an increase in tribalization. There's things that don't seem right in our society. And what has happened in the discourse is over and over again, we are told that work is the problem. And intuitively, I believe work is the solution. That through work, through meaning, through self-worth, through earned success, these concepts, I think, lead to an entirely different psyche for the human being, lead to a greater social cooperation, and provide certain connection to mediating institutions that don't require us to just go home every night and get mad politically as we either watch Fox News or MSNBC. It's, like everything has gotten so tribal politically. But I think if people were more connected into their careers to thinking about job advancement, I think that we would be a more mentally healthy society. And then even apart from that macro social commentary, yeah, I think individually, this idea of people getting married way later, therefore they're having kids way later. And I believe that Anthony Bradley has taught me a lot about this. I think marryable people are more employable and employable people are more marryable. And there's a virtuous cycle in that. But us celebrating people, and again, this is mostly men, celebrating guys being 30 years old that don't have a job and are living at home, this extended adolescence, I just am utterly awestruck by how systemic it's become.
It's interesting because so you approach this basically at the stage before the one I usually think about it. When you talked about tribalization and all of these negative effect of the lack, usually I think about the impact of the lack of economic growth, where we used to grow, at 3.5% a year, between the 1950s to the 70s or 80s, and now like really in the 2000s it's been 2% more or less, and the impact of this. There's a fantastic book by Benjamin Friedman at Harvard. I think it was published in 2006 called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, and it talks about what happens when the economic growth slows, and of course there's the wealth effect. We know all this, and that's what we economists always talk about. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is actually the tribalism, the lack of tolerance, the lack of peace, the anger, the anguish, the dissolution of family. This is well documented, but you take it a step further because you actually focus on why the economy is declining. And it's really interesting. So let's talk about why these men are dropping out of the labor force.
Well, and I think that there is a multi-causal explanation. And then what I ended up doing with a lot of the book is focusing on the causation within the church, where I think many would have thought that the Catholic social thought and the Protestant work ethic, that in these various traditions of Christianity, that there was a robust view of work. And I think in the American experiment, there was. And I think the Tocquevillian description of American life was rooted in a work ethos. And I think there was a Protestant work ethic and all of those things historically. And my belief is that over the last 100 years, a lot happened to cause men and women of faith to retreat from public life, to view their faith in a more private context and to almost surrender in the public square. And therefore, it became a pretty logical consequence of that engagement in commerce, in the marketplace, in career opportunity, and just overall in commercial society, that having others run with the ball in technology and manufacturing and engineering, in finance, in entrepreneurial endeavors, that was sort of accepted. And what I'm intrigued by is that a lot of people of faith have decided to re-engage in politics. Around 40 years ago, a lot of people said, okay, this isn't going well. And you had kind of a resurgence of Christian engagement on the right in the political sphere. And there's very clear evidence that people got fired up in education. There's just millions of homeschoolers that didn't exist in the late 1970s. But throughout the 80s, 90s, and now into the 2000s, the homeschool movement, the Christian school movement, the classical school movement, this is a massive block of people out of faith re-engaging in education. But where is it with work? Where is it on Wall Street? Where is it in Hollywood? Where is it in Silicon Valley? And then outside of those more elite structures, where is it even just in terms of the concept of family-owned businesses, where I don't see a celebration of risk-taking? And that is back to your word before, a discourse I want to see restored, where rather than every sermon one hears about work being a warning, I want it to be a celebration.
Yeah, it was a really interesting chapter, the one that the sermon you will never hear or you never hear. I mean, I thought it was really really interesting. What about, so how does this work? How does work and the reduction of work, how does it fit in? How does it fit in basically is it the culture that feeds in to the loss of work? And then there's a negative feedback loop to, family, friends, community, faith. I mean, how does it work? How do you see these things connecting? Which direction does the causation arrow go?
Well, I am of this belief, a lot of this is sort of part of my economic way of thinking, that most things in life are either going to be negative feedback loops, bad things that get worse, or positive feedback loops, virtuous cycles where it's good things that get better. And I think that culture, family, church, work all feed off of each other. And so in order to generate some improvement, I think that there has to be a reconnection with the basic reality of what work is. That work is, at a macro level, producing goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, and on a micro level, a step in a journey in our lives, and that it's a part of our identity. And when we discover that, it opens up the door to making decisions that are more holistic, that are more strategic, that are more thoughtful, that are more satisfying. and getting outside of what I think is the pop psychology babble that has really surrounded our views of work in today's culture. The chase your dreams mantra has done a lot of damage. And here I am celebrating the merits of work, but I'm saying, has it ever occurred to anybody to chase what they're good at?
Yeah.
And that they will really like it when they do, that your skills become your passions. Because people really love to do what they're good at. They have a funny way of liking being complimented, getting raises, getting bonuses, being in an environment in which they're encouraged and stimulated that way. And so developing skills that we then work into and having a long-term view, that's what I feel very bad for in the current Gen Z. People at 25 or 26 questioning, I'm not doing what I wanted to be doing. Is this really missional? Is this really satisfying? And
and really asking actually their employers to provide them with a meaning for work, right?
It lacks, I think, the proper timeline and perspective. I view the journey of these things as being very rewarding and satisfying, more so than the destination. But in the actual moments, if you're looking at each point of the journey as if it were supposed to be a destination, then I think you'll end up being very disappointed and having unrealistic expectations of your employer as well. I'm also very critical. This ties into the same question, even though it's kind of a separate point, but I'm very critical of the retirement culture. And I think that one of the reasons is that the mentality that, Gen Xers like me that, are kind of becoming old and don't want to admit it. When I sit around being critical of Gen Y millennials or the Gen Zers, I'm not really being critical. I mean, I'm certainly not being critical of the Gen Zers, who I actually have a lot of empathy for and a lot of hope for. But yeah, I think the millennial attitude, as critical as I may be, I believe they got it from baby boomers. Baby boomers worked their tails off. They produced more goods and services than any generation in history. Their gross economic output of the baby boomers is unparalleled, but they did so with an eye on something called retirement that had been totally foreign in world history. And I think that what happened out of that was a messaging that essentially the purpose of work is to not do it anymore. And I think that the millennials picked up that mentality in a lot of ways and sort of expanded it into its logical conclusion. Why be excited about work if the whole reason you're doing it is to stop doing it? And therefore, why not rather than wait till I'm 62 to start a 30-year vacation, why not force some more vacationary leisure, recreational amenities out of life when I'm 23 at 4 o'clock? And so things like a 32-hour work week and things like going to yoga class at 4 p.m, that gets introduced really kind of with the same rationale that ending your life on a 30-year vacation does.
Yeah, and of course, we have our entire federal budget reflects this priority of retirement, right? It's like our biggest budget item, and even though it's heading towards insolvency in less than 10 years, where benefits are going to be cut, and probably what politicians are going to do is just basically start borrowing to fill the gap. No one wants to talk about this because it is a very, very politically tricky topic, because people think this is a right. And it's not just a right, but it's also a right that should be paid by other people. And because there's a lot of evidence that Social Security is a disincentive even to save for your own retirement. But so you're not against rest, right? Because you make the case in the book. It's like you don't like the retirement concept, but you very much, the way you think about it is work, rest, right?
Oh, well, you're very right. And in fact, I would suggest that I'm more pro-rest than people who talk about work-life balance are. Because I think work and rest are definable, structural, separable. And then if I can continue beating this horse, They are normative. They are creationally normative. What I mean by that is that the suggestion that we work 6 days and rest one was modeled by God in creation. Then it was repeated to us as a commandment, but then it was explained to us that the reason we should do it is because it's the exact same thing that God did. So there's a normative standard for 6 days of work and 1 day of rest that I believe is very, very useful in how we think about it. And it doesn't require us to pretend that our lives are to be a pie chart of, well, I have this amount of time with the kids this day and this amount this day, and I'm going to go to the office this day, but I have to leave at 5. I can't leave before and I can't leave after, as opposed to the seasonal realities. When you first asked me about my story, I was talking about the seminal moment being the financial crisis. Let me just tell you that I was not going home at 5 o'clock very much during the financial crisis. Though that was a period of time. It was a season that required me to be working brutal hours from very early to very late with the full support and love of my wife as a means of getting through this period that was necessary in terms of what my job and whatnot involved. And there are other periods in which I need to leave the office early for a kid's school event, a soccer game. But see, work-life balance acts as if there's this kind of asset allocation that one can magically discover, or that other people have an obligation to provide for you. And I don't think it makes sense to describe work-life balance if I believe work is a key part of my life. I don't balance a part of my life with my life. Balance doesn't work that way. Yeah. And nobody says it about anything else. They do not say marriage life balance.
Well, by the way, as you're talking, I'm realizing also that it's the same people who are constantly complaining about income inequality that are preaching the work-life balance. Because the truth of the matter is, if people who have lower income, who have as much dignity in their work than they have in their jobs, they don't have the luxury of balancing like this, leaving at 4, or having a mental health day and things like this. I never actually thought about it this way.
Oh no, I think you're exactly right. But I bet it's funny. Great minds think alike, I guess, because I've actually said that. All this talk about lower work, the 32-hour work week, work-life balance. Listen, they can say they are repulsed by income inequality or wealth inequality all they want. You are not going to get entrepreneurs, type A, risk takers, the sort of top 20% of achievers and producers. You're not going to get them to do this.
Yes.
And so all of work-life balance is obviously meant towards getting some to work less, not to get some to work more.
Yeah, that's right. So in the little time we have left, I want to talk about policy a little bit. One of the things I really actually liked in the book is you argue that the dignity of mankind is better protected in a free market, and economic policies should reflect that fundamental truth. Can you elaborate on how economic growth, innovation, deregulation contribute to the dignity of mankind, and why these are crucial for free market supporters?
Yes, and where this is specifically tied into my beliefs about work is that where people will express frustration in work, or the belief that there's a sort of tediousness to their job, that they feel they're stuck in a menial work and they want something better. What I say is, I can't answer all the micro situations, what decision Johnny should make, and if his uncle has a company in Texas he could go work for, but he wants to stay in Florida. And, there's specific time and place circumstances that in a micro level I can't speak to. But on a macro level, I know that free markets and a free society have created more opportunity for laborers than anything in history, that there is a dynamism in our society that allows people to pursue specialization in a way that is unprecedented for thousands of years. And so this specialization, this division of labor, which is a very standard classical economic construct, division of labor is a byproduct of a market economy. We must celebrate and defend, protect, and expand freedom in the marketplace, because the macro environment out of that, by which people have more room, more freedom, more mobility, and the ability for their station in life to change. It's the single most disingenuous thing in all economic analysis, that we talk about how the bottom 20% are doing and how the top 20% are doing, and we never, ever, ever talk about how many people that were in the bottom 20 no longer are. The mobility to move in your station in life. This is the key component of a market economy. It comes from work, and we must defend these macro principles with every breath in our body.
So then I want to ask you, how concerned are you about the fact that there appears to be a growing convergence between the right and the left on policies such as industrial policy, cronyism, protectionism, and large-scale redistribution, which, I mean, is really going to be getting in the way even more than the current regime we have in free market? And are you concerned that this trend may have really a negative impact on the future of work, even though when it comes to the right, they are claiming that they are doing it for work. They're doing it because they're concerned about men having dropped out of the labor force.
Well, I would say that I'm not just concerned about it, I'm petrified. It's a big portion of what I discuss at my podcast at National Review called Capital Record, because I believe in everything you just said, that effectively the right's flirtation with, even if it is right-wing oriented populism, the industrial policy and other such ideas of state intervention ultimately are cronyist. I think that they fail to protect who they say they will protect, and that they are riddled with broken window fallacies all over the place. That they end up creating invisible effects that are far worse than the visible effects. I do not believe that they protect the worker, but a lot of that is that I don't accept the basic premise that the primary cause of what we have with the worker is effectively trade policy. I obviously understand that there are dynamics where certain innovations, much more, by the way, technological than trade, can damage certain sectors and groups of people. And I think it becomes cliche at some point to talk about the horse and buggy and the Industrial Revolution and Schumpeterian creative destruction. It's too bad that it's considered cliche, because it's all accurate and it all needs to be said. But what I will say is I insist on being a truth teller, and celebrating mobility and dynamism is the only solution.
Well, yeah, and also, I mean, it's really interesting to me that this is a path that we share that concern about men dropping out of the labor force. But like when you go and look at who has dropped out and for what reason, the Joint Economic Committee has put out studies that look at actually why are the men dropping out of the labor force? And a vast majority of men dropping out of the labor force is not that they can't find jobs. Some of them is like they're staying longer in school. Some of them is that they retire, but that's a very small minority. The big one is disability insurance. So that would be a big, big thing to address.
Well, huge, and it's a cultural problem. It isn't solved with public policy. It isn't. When you have a moral rot that creates an 800% increase in private disability claims, as if back pain has become contagious, then these are issues that I think are cultural problems that require cultural solutions. And it is an expediency that says we would like some sort of state intervention. But what the right has traditionally believed, that I still believe, is in a Hayekian understanding of the knowledge problem. I do not trust a central planner to navigate our way through this. I don't believe they have the time, place, circumstances to adjudicate decisions best made between producers and consumers. And I am very convinced that it entrenches power, which leads to cronyism. And so it's misguided all the way through. And the various cultural and moral issues that many are trying to solve for, I simply believe are going to require patience, because it took decades to get this bad, and it might take decades to get better, but the state is ill-equipped to fix it. And in this sense, I proudly continue to wear the label fusionist.
I'm with you. So I want to ask you actually the one of the things that your opinion, one of the things that actually really concerns me. I never thought I would ever say, as a woman or as the mother of daughters, I'm really concerned about a trend on the right about this obsession with single income earner. And I respect women who stay at home. I think if women want to work, fine. I recognize that it creates some cultural tension. It's been reported, right? But I'm really concerned about this, because I think first it ignores, that work is also beneficial for women, that work can also benefit families. But I'm just, and I'm concerned because I can see some people trying to set this as a goal to return to an era that actually really only existed during the 50s, where a married couple with one single earner were the majority. It wasn't, the curve of the labor force participation for women is actually U-shaped. So, But anyway, so I'm curious with your approach to work and your understanding of work, what do you think about this?
Well, if it is what you mean, do I have an opinion as to whether or not we should have single income or two income families?
No, I'm more thinking about, are you concerned about some of the people on the new right setting as a goal to use the government basically to return to a time where, married couple are families are mostly one income earner?
Yeah. So what I would say is that I'm concerned about it immensely, in the sense that I find it to be utterly preposterous that they could possibly have the government do that. Do I believe that house prices are too high? I do.
Yeah. Yes.
And therefore that there are some families working two income as a result of that otherwise may not want to, that their preference for their family might be single income with stay at home with the children for a period, but they can't because of the cost of housing. I think that's entirely possible and probably a very, very predominant situation. But the idea that the government can fix these dynamics is crazy to me. Now, culturally speaking, I don't believe that this happened as a result of any policy. That in other words, the sexual revolution, the Great Society, some of the issues in more modern feminism that, of course, has had different waves and whatnot, these things were not a byproduct of policy. The policy followed the cultural movement. So I have opinions about what me and my family do, and I have opinions about what make for healthy cultures and communities. But the government being able to centrally plan this stuff to that level of detail strikes me as rather Orwellian.
Yeah. It's I am worried, and I am not a worrier. I just hear some discourse on the right that really worries me. And on the left, right? And you see this on the right too. A lot of them are pushing for policies that will have the outcome of actually hurting working women. When you look at the literature on paid leave, on government imposed paid leave, you see that women, first, it doesn't address any motherhood gap, but it also reduced the number of hours and pay and promotion of women.
Well, and also what can't be measured in the data is businesses that don't hire because
Yeah.
they know biology, and they can look at a 28-year-old woman and say, I can't afford to have to pay this person in 5 years for 4 months or 8 months or whatever the case ends up being. And so the data can't measure that they end up not hiring.
Yeah.
And I think that those types of situations are unintended consequences. And so in that case, you have left-wing policies trying to promote two-income households, but then you're also describing so-called right-wing policies trying to promote one-income households.
And those two trends are
Yeah, they converge into the same place. And those of us who favor an economic worldview that is rooted in decision making at a local level, where there are incentives and where there is knowledge. That's all it means to me to be a free marketeer. And I don't believe that Washington, D.C. has the knowledge or the incentives to plan these things for families.
I could ask you 25 million more questions, but I have one last question. What is the most mistaken claim that you would like to correct about the topic of your book?
I believe, if I can conclude with something back to the theological, work was not a curse because of sin entering the world. Work was a blessing that existed before sin. It was immediately upon God making mankind. I believe we were made to work, to steward the garden. And when you read the verses, multiply and fill the earth, I hate to tell some of my guy friends that was not just a procreative commandment. There was going to be a need for some infrastructure if we were going to fill the earth. And so beyond the biology of it, there was an economics in it. And to steward the garden, to care and cultivate and have dominion over the earth, the creativity of naming the animals. Work was a blessing that is what we were made for. And an economic way of thinking requires us to see the work we do now in the same context, which is producing goods and services that meet the needs and wants of humanity.
Well, thank you so much, David. It was great.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
So, listener, next week, I'm having David again to talk about a topic that I love, the Japanification of the U.S. economy. So make sure to listen. Thank you.